Is Miraidon mid or good? No good matchups, Rhydon. Mid is too generous. It's bad, Rhydon. Mid Rhydon. It's basically turn 1 KO and hope they brick so you run away with the prize race, the deck. Mid Rhydon. And I only play mid decks. I would know. Miraidon D's nuts. Got him. Mid is too generous. No. Middest of all mids. Miraidon is mid. I'm always happy to see it across from me. Mid City. Miraidon. The top of mid, if you will. The most mid. Pile Rhydon, with a full bench. Mid Rhydon. Mid Rhydon. Mid Rhydon. Mid Rhydon. King of bricked games. Welcome back, OnGaard Army. I know it's been a minute, but I've needed to take a bit of a break to focus on my studies and reevaluate the direction I want to go with my content. But enough about that. Let's talk about a deck I feel is severely underrated in this format. Miraidon. Miraidon has a lot of variation to it, but is primarily boiled down to two builds, Miraidon Regieleki and Miraidon Flaffy, but both have a similar game plan, which is to quickly build up a board state and take big KOs as fast as possible. And despite a nearly 70% majority of people believing the deck is mid via a poll on my Twitter, go follow my Twitter by the way, link in the description for that, it has some very prominent results. Prior to the release of Scarlet and Violet outside of Japan, Shin Anageta's Miraidon Regieleki deck with Magnezone V-Star won the 2,488-player Miyagi Champions League. Then, after the global release of the Scarlet and Violet set, Robert Kimbrum's Turbo Miraidon Regieleki deck came top 8 at the European International Championships. One might think, oh, this was the first big tournament of the format, it must have taken people by surprise. But since then, Anthony Perez has top 8'd Portland Regionals with a very interesting Miraidon Flaffy build, and Marcus Lim Zhanghe's Miraidon build, which we unfortunately do not currently have a list for, top 8'd the Singapore Regional League. So the deck has some solid placings under its belt already. Now let's go over some Pokemon stats, courtesy of PokeStats. At first glance, its matchup spread does not look amazing. Generally, you want to see 40+% for each matchup. But if we click over from generic decks to specific decks, the matchup spread begins to look a lot better. We should also consider tie rates on our assessments, because if tie rates plus the win rates adds up to over 50%, that means the other deck had an under 50% win rate too, which means the matchup is much closer than it appears. Arceus decks are very favored due to how easy it is to KO them and their inability to KO a Miraidon with Trinity Nova. Lost Tina is the easiest Lost Zone matchup because they need to bench 2 prizers early, which with early aggression, you can KO before they get set up. Also, if you play Echoing Horn, you are able to put their Giratina back onto the bench after you KO it, and take another 2 prizes. So you'll almost always be winning the game faster versus this particular Lost Zone variant. And then the Miraidon mirror is sort of a coin toss, as it's almost always who can take 3 KOs faster. Obviously, this can differ depending on the build of Miraidon. Some may be playing Klefki, some may be playing Flaffy, but generally it's about a 50-50. And then we get into the actual matchups to consider when deck building, as these are the easier matchups, and therefore you don't need to consider them as heavily when you are building your deck. Arc Dura is the hardest Arc build to face due to how hard it is to KO Dura, and the fact that they KO Miraidon with max pulverization. On top of that, some builds play Alolan Vulpix, which you can only hit with Regieleki V unless you play some sort of other tech, or if you're playing the Flaffy build with Raichu V. However, a simple way to drastically improve your chances of winning is to play Echoing Horn, which I personally think every variation of the deck should play. Being able to take 2 2-prize knockouts and then Horn Gust KO another 2-prizer to get around Duraludon VMAX or Alolan Vulpix V-Star makes the matchup a ton easier, especially if you can Gust a Vulpix or a Dura early, saving the Arceus for a later KO because it never threatens a one-hit KO on a Miraidon EX, and then KOing the Arceus before Horn bossing a third 2-prizer for game. Lost Box decks depend on the build. Each variation will obviously do better or worse against Miraidon. The decks that rely on 2-prizers like Giratina and Goodra are the easier matchups in my opinion. because you tend to out-aggress Tina, and versus Goodra, if you play at least 2 escape ropes, it's very easy to rope Gust around the damage reduction to get KOs. The Goodra matchup says 37% here, but I think it's easy for the number to get dragged down that low if most Miraidon decks aren't running ropes or aren't running enough ropes. I think with 2 ropes and an Echoing Horn, both matchups are good matchups for the deck. Normal Greninja lost boxes such as Kyogre or other similar builds are pretty easy to manage. You just want to pressure with Lightning Wall early, and if they rope you, you send up Greninja and they can't one-hit KO it without swinging with a 2-prizer. If they swing with a 2-prizer, you're trading favorably with it anyway, and a lot of times you can simply out-prize race them. I would recommend not putting down the lower HP basic Vs in this matchup, like Raikou, because they can take advantage of that by 2-hit KOing with Lost Mine, or by being able to Kyogre for only 4 energy. Turbo Lost Box is a low win rate because in a best of 3 format, if they manage to pull off a turn 1 Dragonite attack, they do tend to out-aggress you, and Sablezard is hard to trade favorably with. That's not to say that these matchups are impossible, though. If you go second, you remove their early game pressure and can prize race them effectively, starting with a turn 1 Lightning Wall KO. Again, if they rope you, you can send up Greninja and they can't one-hit KO it either, and if you play Switch Cart, you can also heal a Miraidon out of range of being 2-hit KO'd by Cram plus Lost Mine, or any other 2-prizer out of range of double Cram. The biggest issue is the builds with Galarian Zapdos, because it is an attacker that is very hard to play around, that always trades favorably or evenly with you. It isn't extremely common in Lost Box decks, but my advice is that if you expect to face Galarian Zapdos, add Klefkis to the deck. Klefki is a basic 1-prizer that shuts off the abilities of all basic Pokemon. This includes Comfey and Greninja. Considering this, it also helps swing the matchup of all Lost Box matchups pretty heavily, with Regielecki's first attack boosted by either 2 Regielecki VMAX, or 1 Regielecki VMAX and a Cleansing Gloves, or one of these 2 things and one of the baby Zapdos from Pokemon Go to add your damage to 10, you can take KOs while pivoting into Klefki and keeping your opponent locked. If they rope you, you either have a second Klefki in play to send up, or they're forced to use a rope just to do the basic function of their deck. You can send up something like a Miraidon or a Greninja, and Switch Cart out of range of 2-hit KO on Miraidon, or just have them not KO the Greninja. So the best ways to approach this matchup are to either play enough Switch Carts to heal out of 2-hit KO range, or Klefkis to slow down the opposing Lost Box player. Mew is definitely one of those more awkward matchups, because it's pretty simple to take the first 4 prizes of the game. However, Miraidon struggles against Disruption, so on the turn that you take your second KO, they are going to Roxanne you, and it will be hard to take the last KO after that. Fusion Strike Mew is an easier matchup because both decks play the same way. Take KOs as quickly as possible. You're just racing them to be the first to take 3 KOs, and Fusion Strike Mew plays little to no disruption. Mew Path, on the other hand, is the harder matchup due to the before-mentioned disruption. Drapion is certainly a way to improve both of these matchups, and if you want an extremely favored matchup, Drapion plus Skyseal Stone lets you skip the Roxanne turn entirely, but this can hurt your other matchups. Klefki does help here because it shuts down their Genesects, so you can slow them down in the early game or buy time in the late game to draw out of the Roxanne, but it doesn't put on nearly as much pressure as it does in the Lost Box matchup. What I have found to be the best way to deal with Mew is to save double Forest Stone and put them down together before taking your second KO. A 1-1 Bibarel line is also a decent consideration to draw out of Roxanne. Gardevoir is an unfavored matchup. The fact that they can win in 2 attacks KOing a 2-prizer and then using Skyseal Stone plus Zacian to KO Regielecki VMAX per game makes this matchup super awkward. You can either choose to not evolve a Lucky V, or evolve all of them at once and go for a Gardevoir EX KO. Cleansing Gloves helps a lot with this, and early swings with Lightning Wall can make it hard for them to take that initial KO. So a Gardevoir EX KO after some early Alecki pressure can put you in a position to win the prize race. But it's still hard if they get everything they need. However, there are a few ways to swing the matchup. The best inclusion for this matchup is Magnezone V-Star. A 2-1 Magnezone V-Star line can let you use the Magnezone V's first attack to pull up and KO a Manaphy, and then follow up with a Magnezone V-Star V-Star attack to KO 2 Kirlia, which destroys the Gardevoir engine. You can play this in either Elecki or Flaffy builds. The Flaffy builds help a lot in this matchup in particular, because you don't ever need to put a VMAX in play, and Raichu V can still reach Gardevoir KO numbers. It honestly surprises me that the win rate is this low versus Lugia. In testing, I've felt the matchup is favored. Going first gives you an extra turn to set up before taking the first KO, because they can't KO turn 1 regardless, giving you the opportunity to start off the prize race. And even if you go second, it isn't hard to take the first KO unless they start a 1-prizer, and get down either a Lugia on the bench and a second 1-prizer, or a Lugia on the bench and a Tyranitar V. The main issue is Tyranitar V having 230 HP, meaning you need either Belt or some other form of modifier to KO it with Miraidon. The two ways to approach this if you can't just Gust KO their Lugia are, you can either Arven for Generator or Rope, whichever one you don't have in your hand initially, and Belt depending on what you need, or you play a Baby Zapdos from Pokemon Go, which boosts your damage by 10, allowing you to hit a clean 230 with a Miraidon attack turn 1. Urshifu is a deck that is unfavored and will stay unfavored. I wouldn't bother trying to tech for it. Echoing Horn helps here, but I think that Echoing Horn should be played in Miraidon regardless, and your opponent will likely try to play the matchup without benching Inteleon at all. If they do bench it, it should be an easy target. Don't overthink it, just play for taking 3 2-prize knockouts, and if they outpace you, oh well. You'll probably never hit more than one of this deck at any tournament you go to. I hadn't really talked much about Flaffy builds much up to this point so far, because I have less experience with them and it doesn't change a lot about your game plan, but let's go over them now. The Flaffy engine doesn't need to play a 3-prizer like Regieleki VMAX to take those big KOs because it has access to Raichu V, and Drapion can be better utilized in Flaffy builds because it can be an attacker in other matchups. Being able to accelerate onto a Dark-type attacker versus Gardevoir is a nice option to have. The Flaffy engine doesn't have a ton of data on Pokestats yet, as there's only one list that's featured on the page and it hasn't been updated with the data from Portland yet, but from speculation I can assume that the Lugia, Mew, and Gardevoir matchups improve. The Arceus matchup stays favored, the Urshifu stays unfavored, and the Lost Box matchup gets worse. Now that I've gone over the stats, how to approach each matchup, and some ways to build your deck for each matchup, let's go over my personal experience with the deck. And from my experience, this deck has the strongest early game of any deck in the format, but has a weaker endgame. Admittedly, you do need to pull ahead at the start to stay ahead, but there are ways to address disruption. As I mentioned earlier, saving your Forest Seal Stone can get you out of bricked hands, but that's not the only way to play around disruption. If your opponent's win con is to path you and disrupt you, avoid playing down your stadiums unless you need to. Save your Pokegears for the late game, because they are more outs to potential win cons like Boss or Research to draw out of a brick. Being enough ahead can give you time to get out of a tight spot as well. Celebration's Mew is also a good inclusion, because if you save your Pokegears, Mew is a Pokemon that you can promote after they take a KO to see the top 6 cards of your deck, and even if you're still pathed, you can grab a Pokegear, which can get you out of the situation. Or, if you're enough ahead, it can grab you a Generator to get more energy on board, so you can 2-shot for game. Even if they do take a KO. If you're worried about being able to manage your outs to disruption, a 1-1 Bibarel line in the deck is a good way to combat a late-game Roxanne, and Lost Vacuum is a good consideration for builds that run Arven to tutor it. Now on to people's main concern about the deck, whiffing Electric Generator. I found that 14 is the sweet spot for energy, and playing double Raikou V makes for a great cheap fallback attacker if you only hit 1 energy off Generator. But let's go over the math for certain scenarios to show how consistent the deck can be. After setting 6 prizes, drawing 7 for a starting hand, and drawing for turn, if you are using Miraidon to thin 4 Pokemon out of your deck, leaving a bench space open for Greninja, there are 42 cards left in deck. If we assume that we have done no other thinning, and 10 of the 14 energy are in deck, just to take a realistic number of the amount of energy that might be in deck turn 1, using a hypergeometric distribution probability calculator, there would be a 76% chance that you hit a minimum of 1 energy off of the Generator. This is without thinning at all with any card other than Miraidon EX, and having not played a supporter yet. with the ability to draw more with Greninja and Raikou, use Nest Ball, Ultra Ball, Arven, and Forest Stone to thin specific cards out of your deck, use multiple generators in a turn, and attaching at the end of your turn to control where your energy are after the generator, it is very easy to get off a turn 1 attack. In my experience with simply running turn 2 test hands with the turbo version of the deck, out of 50 test hands, 48 of the 50 hands accomplished a turn 1 attack of some form, not including Switching Bolt. 13 of them were Lightning Rondo, 21 of them were Lightning Wall, and 14 of them were Photon Blast. This was with the Turbo Miraidon build that is currently on screen, which I also happened to come second place at a challenge with. 90% of games starting off with some sort of attack, and 70% of them being a 3 energy attack seems pretty good, right? Obviously, the probabilities vary depending on your prizing, hand, what thinning you do, the way you build your deck, etc. And the probabilities for generator will vary throughout the game depending on how many energy you have in deck. Just keep account of your remaining energies in deck, and attach energy after all other possible actions to best improve your odds, and not put yourself into a bad situation that you could have avoided. This deck may not be the best deck in format, but it's certainly a solid deck that is a ton of fun to play, and has realistic win cons against most decks. I've taken different builds of Miraidon to 3 different challenges, and the deck felt solid at each event. The first one I went with the EUIC-inspired Turbo Miraidon list, hitting 3 Lost Box decks, an Arceus Regidrago deck, and a Darkrai deck. I ended 4-1, coming second at this 24-person challenge, with my only loss being to a Lost Tina deck that played Galarian Zapdos, who won the event. Then I played a teched-out Klefki build based on Eliza Sheetpost data-driven Miraidon skeleton. Go follow her on Twitter because she periodically makes these awesome deck breakdowns of deck card counts to create solid skeletons of decks. I played this expecting a lot of Lost Box, and I hit 3 Lost Box at this event, beating a Lost Tina and a regular Lost Box build, and losing to a Lost Box build with Galarian Zapdos in a close set. I beat a Gardevoir Mewtwo deck and a Mew deck, and then intentionally drew with a Dialga player in round 6 to guarantee top 8 because 5-1 wasn't guaranteed for top 4 at this 42-person challenge. So I ended 4-1-1 placing in top 8. And then I played a Miraidon build with Magnezone V-Star because I expected an uptick in Gardevoir at this most recent challenge, and unfortunately did not hit any Gardevoir. I beat a Lost Gudra deck and a Lugia deck, lost a close game against Mew because I didn't hit Belt for game, and then hit Rapid Strike Urshifu and got absolutely bodied, losing my win-in into top 4, ending 2-2. From my experience, I think that Magnezone V-Star is a bit of a trap because it's 3 slots in a deck to help with 1 matchup, and having a 2 retreat cost and V-Star power that only hits bench is super awkward to try and play around with. But it was a fun experiment. Ultimately, I don't think Magnezone is worth it at present unless you are playing the Flaffy build. I hope you enjoyed this video. I've been thinking a lot about the direction of my content going forward, and I've decided that I want to start putting more time into making videos of better quality, rather than trying to push out regular weekly content. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, and smash that subscribe button for more Pokemon content. Let me know in the comments whether this video convinced you that Miraidon is good, or if you still think that it's mid-Rhydon. Remember gamers, play Echoing Horn in Miraidon, keep count of energies in deck, attach after all other actions, believe in your generators, and I will catch you all later.